We're looking at, Saba and I were looking at survivors of ethnic violence. That is the issue we're looking at. And as to its importance, I think this is an issue that gives us a very different perspective on politics in South Asia, especially post-colonial politics in South Asia, as to who gets included and who gets excluded from politics. So, as we were talking earlier in the morning, I think there's enough work that's being done on who's excluded, which classes are excluded, which gender is excluded from everyday life and participating in social life. But politically, the big stories have centered around three axes, if you like. One has been caste, the other has been religion, and the third has been language. Right? And then we think that when it comes to territory, imperial India was carved up into two, and we think that that's the end of the story. We don't want to deal with, or we're unable to deal with some kind of grassroots mobilization from below, which thinks of territory not as a state subject, not as an imperial subject where people have to carve out, where empires are carved out by big politicians, but where people in villages think that they have a right to a territory, right? And the story of Northeast India actually complicates the idea of exclusion that we have in South Asia, especially in India. One is, of course, a territory that is imaginative, that's inclusive of other people, that is inclusive of, you know, one's memory of what this territory is, and it is also a place where one finds, one finds nurturing, where one finds ability to move ahead in life, and it's also an idea that you can, that's your home. Right? This may sound wonderful in itself, but what happens is when you want to translate this into a political vocabulary, when you use politics to kind of say that, look, if I have to be modern, this territory has to have a map, right? And that is essentially the mark of being modern for any community, for any people, for any nationality. So then it becomes a little bit more complicated in a place like Northeast India, where you have many, I hate the word ethnic, it's overused. You have many communities living together. They've been living together for the longest time, and yet believe in a colonial fiction that they inhabit different universes, right? And this colonial fiction is really, really very central to what is happening today. And this is really this is what colonial authority did in Africa, right, with the censuses, right? So, for instance, in a colonial census, and Mahmoud Mamdani has written a lot about this in the case of Africa, in the case of Sudan, that there are either tribes or natives or races, right? And of course, the whites are races. So the native and the tribe are categories that belong to a different order of the census. So even in Northeast India, you have colonial authority putting people in different spaces, right? So you have a hill tribe. So for the purpose of a census, you have colonial authority designating X community as a hill tribe, regardless of the fact that they may be living anywhere, right? Or another community as a plains tribe, to differentiate them from other communities. So over time, what has happened, given the fact that we have we owe a lot, our political vocabulary in India owes a lot to the colonial movement. We have allowed these colonial fences to become our own, right? We treat them as though they were realities on the ground, right, when we do politics. So it's not surprising that the territorial idea, which on an everyday level is a wonderful idea, that I grew up speaking several languages, right? By any modern social science standard, I would be considered a cosmopolitan person, right? A polyglot, a cosmopolitan person. And this would be true for any young person growing up anywhere in Northeast India. You would speak at least 4 languages, right? And you would switch from one to the other effortlessly. But when it comes to doing politics, you just close down these worlds. Your knowledge of a different language is no longer a window into another world. It is a door that you close, right? So it is. So territory becomes something as a metaphor. It becomes as heavy as this. I'm not allowing you to live in my territory, even if you speak my language, because your tongue is different. Right? So you've begun to naturalize what colonial authority says about where you should live. And this, I'm a social anthropologist, this I find completely absurd on the ground. And yet this is a reality, political reality one has to deal with every day. 4 districts in Western Assam, which are 4 designated districts, which are called the Boro Territorial Areas District. They fall within the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, and there's a long history to it. I think in the 40s, when the British were asking around and asking questions as to what would happen when the transfer of power happened, certain areas of the northeast which were excluded from, let's say, excluded from direct rule, right? They exclude partially and partially excluded and excluded areas. These were then governed as part of the 6th schedule, where community law applied. And this is just a very kind of, a very quick telegraphic almost account of what happened. And there was supposed to be special laws preventing land alienation in these areas. This was what happened. What then later became the hill states of the northeast, mainly Nagaland, Meghalaya, and Mizoram. So the plains tribes of Assam said, look, if the hill tribes have got their designated homelands, which the land was not alienated because the British did not allow other people to migrate there, then by right we should also have access to the same kind of homeland, same kind of territory, which is where our land and our resources belong to us. So the Plains Tribal Council of Assam in the 1960s demanded a separate state of Udayachal, which would then have all the safeguards of the hill states, right, for the indigenous communities of these areas. Don't forget, because Assam was one of the most sought after destinations for that huge 19th century labor migration that happened from India to other parts of the world, where people went to Fiji, to Mauritius. They also came to Assam. So a lot of so then, to cut it short, the Plains Tribe Council of Assam, the Udayachal movement, included various Plains tribe groups of Assam, which by 1980s realized that they couldn't throw in their lot with the bigger caste Assamese communities, because in between, the whole Assam agitation against deportation of foreigners happened, right, in the 1978 to 1985, where large sections of Assamese educated middle class people said that our politics, Republican politics, is no longer working for us, because this one person, one vote thing is going against us, because we have a lot of people who are not indigenous to Assam and who are voting here. And this has been a very, very old debate in Assam. It goes back to the 1920s and 30s, and it still hasn't been resolved. Right? So Western Assam then, by the 1970s, threw in its lot, because they were the ones who lost most land in terms of territory to plantation, to other communities coming in and settling there, and also after partition, a lot of people from erstwhile East Pakistan were settled in these areas by the government of India. So their demands were to actually reclaim some of this. By 1985, all movements have undercurrents. The undercurrent was that this pan-tribal thing is not working. So the biggest tribe amongst these groups, the Boros, decided that they had to carve out their own future. And this has also got to do with the fact that by this time the Boro Boro leaders were being courted by government officials in India, and they were being, in a sense, encouraged to think of a Boro homeland, a Boro territorial council, rather than a pan-tribal territorial council, which is what they asked for. But again, there's another layer to the story. As Assamese nationalists came to power in '85, they completely disregarded Boro sentiment, Boro identity. So Boro politics became more radical. And as if that was not complicated enough, the radicals split into two armed groups. One which was supported by the government of India, the BLT, who 2003 they had a ceasefire, and then they now control the autonomous council, the territorial council, sorry, and another group that remained underground, which was the NDFP, the National Democratic Front of Boroland. And of course, one group was used by the government to fight the other. And in 2009, the NDFP split into two. And this is an exhausting story for someone to listen to, but it's a very common one in any place where there's protracted armed conflict, right? So that's what's happening in Boroland. There are several armed opposition groups, several factions of armed opposition groups, and there are several. I mean, that's the thing. Everybody in Boroland feels excluded, right? Politically, every community, whether it's the Boros themselves, or Rabhas, or Muslim, or Adivasis, feel that they're excluded. The Boros from the larger Assam, the Koch Rajbanshis from what is supposed to be Boroland, and we have not been able to create that political language where these discussions can be non-violent. So one is hoping that the India Exclusion Report, it contributes a little bit at least to creating that safer space where these things can be at least shared instead of becoming points of closure.